So I think we can just dive right in. At the beginning, standard practice is to share where the funding and support comes from for the research that we do. We're really lucky to have a support from a lot of different agencies like the National Institute of Health and the National Science Foundation for the work that I'm going to share with you today. But before I dive in, I just want to say how nice it is to meet you and to introduce myself a little more. So I actually grew up in New York City, and the reason I'm doing what I do today is because of the several years that I spent working with Breakthrough New York, which is a nonprofit organization in New York City. I think it's expanded considerably now. But I had the great fortune of being a math teacher for middle school students, 7th and 8th graders, for full-time over the summers for several years and after school a few days a week. And a lot of my students, I noticed, were struggling with academics, not because of any lack of motivation or amazing intelligence or effort, but because a lot of other stuff was getting in the way, like mental health concerns, like family difficulties, like neighborhood difficulties. And I saw over and over again that they weren't always sure where to go to get help. And even when they were sure where to go to get help, that help wasn't always easy for them to get. Long waiting lists, high costs of treatment. There were lots of barriers in the way. So as I went to Swarthmore College, I started on a research track to figure out, well, what can we do to make mental health support for kids and teens a little bit more accessible than it is right now. I went and got my Ph.D. at Harvard University in clinical psychology, did my clinical psych residency at Yale. And for the past couple of years, I've been at Stony Brook starting up my research lab in the psychology department, and also serving as a consultant for the World Bank to develop easy to share, disseminable, scalable interventions and treatments that are able to be transported to different countries, low and middle income countries mostly. And I've worked in a lot of different school districts with middle and high school students mostly, trying to get interventions into different parts of the ecosystem for kids to access. So today what I hope to share with you all is a little bit about why our lab does the work that we do. And then I want to give you essentially a walkthrough of the kinds of treatments and interventions we create, how we test them, and how you can take a look at them and use them yourselves. Everything we build in our lab is designed to be free, designed to be accessible by anybody, including the kids who might benefit from our programs, and easy to understand from any perspective, regardless of background or proximity to privilege or academia. And I encourage you to imagine how interventions like the ones I'm going to share with you today might be helpful for either you or folks you know, or in your own lives moving forward, because this is really just the beginning of research on new innovative models of how to get treatment out to folks. And many of you, I'm sure, will go on to pursue careers in research and psychology and clinical psych, and it's up to you to decide where this work goes next. All right, so there has been a whole lot of progress in the past several decades, the past 50 years, in identifying interventions and treatments that work for reducing depression, anxiety, and related mental health problems in kids and teens. But we have a very long way to go before meeting the needs of families across the country. So of the kids in the United States today who experience mental health problems, about 20% will access any kind of mental health services for those difficulties. And of that 20%, about 1 in every 5 will receive what professionals, what therapists consider to be a full course of treatment. Most treatments in clinical psychology and psychiatry that treat things like depression or anxiety through psychosocial, like therapy, talk therapy, evidence-based treatments tend to be around 16 sessions. That's how they're designed. But in practice, the mean number of sessions attended is between 3 and 4 by teens in the US today. And the modal number of sessions attended, the most common number of sessions attended, is just 1. So the current model of delivering care to folks doesn't seem to be meeting the needs of people across the country. So we're really going to need new approaches to reduce the burden of mental illness on a large scale. Clinics are hard to access, transportation issues come up, cost issues come up. There are many, many points at which access can become an impossibility. I also want to highlight that there's just not enough therapists. There's not enough psychiatrists or psychologists to meet the needs right now. If we doubled the number of psychiatrists and psychologists and therapists in the country tomorrow, it wouldn't be nearly enough to meet mental health needs across the country for everyone who needs help. This is a map of shortage areas of providers for mental health problems across the US. The blue areas are shortage areas. So almost the whole country is a shortage area for mental health services. So we're not going to be able to fix this problem easily if all we're focusing on is training more professionals. Just to unpack these graphs a little bit, basically the story that they tell is that from 1970 to the present, we haven't really gotten much better at treating things like anxiety and depression, even with our gold standard psychotherapy treatments. Actually, we've gotten worse at treating depression over time, if you take all the clinical trials into account that have been conducted in the past 30, 40 years. So given all of this, there's clearly a real need for treatments that are accessible, that really get to the heart of people's problems, that may improve the effects of the interventions that we already have that may be helpful. But more importantly, to offer something, ideally something with evidence behind it, to the many teenagers and kids who might otherwise access nothing at all. So that's where I hope our lab can come in. The Lab for Scalable Mental Health, I started the lab in 2018 at Stony Brook University, and we have 3 primary goals. Our first goal is to actually design brief, scalable interventions for mental health problems, primarily in adolescents, to figure out how those interventions work so that we can get people the interventions and the treatments that are most likely to help them, so that we can match people based on what they're struggling with to interventions likely to help them the most. And to test new ways of getting interventions out into the real world, or dissemination, beyond just relying on physical clinics, which of course now in the age of the coronavirus and the pandemic has become all the more difficult to access for folks. And one way that we have tried to address these many problems and to reach our goals is by figuring out if brief therapy might be an answer. So specifically, a lot of our work in our lab focuses on one-session treatments. And that might be very different or even totally opposite to what you expect therapy to look like or to be like. But I want to share a little bit about why I think a single session approach is really worth considering from the perspective of access and scalability. One, as you've seen, the need for treatment far outpaces provider availability. At the clinics that do exist, wait lists are extremely long. I'm a clinical supervisor at a clinic at Stony Brook University where we train our Ph.D. students to deliver treatment to kids, teens, and adults. Our wait lists can be up to 6 months depending on the time of the year. If you're in 5th grade, 6 months is a really long time to wait to address a problem that's almost half a school year, that's more than half a school year to wait. So that's really not acceptable. Attending multiple sessions of therapy isn't always possible for people. In schools, in settings like emergency rooms, in primary care, your doctor's office, in inpatient hospital settings, people aren't there for long, long periods of time. Weekly therapy isn't always a possibility. So different models have to be considered. And the fact is, as you saw earlier, many people get single session treatment whether or not they need to. It's the most common number of sessions that people attend. So it's time, our lab thinks, to think about how can we fit something useful into the format of care that many people are already getting, whether or not they choose to. But the most important piece of why we think a single session approach might be useful to examine is that you can actually do something meaningful in just one session if you're very intentional about it. So some examples of SSIs, that's an acronym that we use for single session interventions because it's a lot shorter, that work. So a few years ago, I ran what's called a meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is when you basically collect all of the treatment studies that have been done for a specific topic, like here, all the treatment studies for mental health problems that had been done, and put them together to average across them to see overall what are the average effects of the treatments we're looking at. And in this meta-analysis, first of all, I found that there were already 50 clinical trials that tested single session interventions for youth mental health problems, including anxiety, behavior problems, and depression. And in many cases, those single session programs were just as helpful as longer term therapy, which was very interesting to learn, very surprising to learn, but hopeful also. Some more specific examples in adults. In a study of 98 adults who completed a walk-in therapy service in Canada, 44% reported that one session was sufficient to address their clinical needs, even 1 month later. Single session exposure therapy, which is where you gradually and in a safe environment, a controlled environment, expose yourself to feared thoughts to kind of demonstrate to yourself that you can tolerate them and that they're not actually dangerous. Single session exposure therapy helped cure PTSD, helped reduce PTSD symptoms in people exposed to a natural disaster up to 2 years later. Another study found that in a hospital setting, when a single session of something called solution-focused therapy was delivered, 12-month rehospitalization rates were cut in half among adults who were headed to the ER after experiencing self-harm or suicidal attempts. So clearly one session can be powerful. Some really important assumptions to keep in mind. Some of the things that make a one session treatment potentially useful. There are some assumptions that include that something good can come from one session and that one session may be the last. So this puts the person who's receiving the treatment, and if there is a provider who's delivering the treatment, in this mindset where change expectations, improvement expectations are set high, and expectations can make so much of a difference in outcome, especially for therapy. The expectation is set that change can and is expected to occur in any given moment. There's something in 1975 that was labeled Parkinson's law in psychotherapy, which is the tendency for therapy to expand or contract to fit the time allotted. So if you think therapy is going to last a year and you give it a year, it'll last a year. But if you are very intentional about targeting something really meaningful in one session, you can also facilitate change then. It's also the case that an assumption of single session approaches is that people, every single one of us, already has the inner capacity to alter our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors to bring about significant and important changes in our lives. That is, we assume strength in people who are receiving these treatments. We assume competence. We assume that they can make a difference for themselves, which is a really empowering approach to treatment that isn't always assumed in longer term therapies. I also want to highlight at this point that I am not trying to convince you, and I do not believe that single session treatment should replace existing models of therapy. I think the key to meeting the need on a large scale of mental health treatment needs is to have diverse arrays of avenues and opportunities to get multiple types of treatment. But I do think that single session approaches have an important place in the overall mental health care ecosystem, and that they can fill some of the gaps that traditional models of service delivery aren't able to meet. So that's the context I hope that you can keep in mind as I share some of our recent work on this. So now I want to talk to you a little bit about online or digital single session interventions, which I think are very important and which is a big focus of our work for reasons that I hope will become clear. So because there's such limited treatment access, the idea of low-cost, self-guided digital interventions or treatments has really been very big, has appealed a whole lot to researchers, providers, and clients. And you all probably are very familiar with the plethora, the hundreds of mental health care apps that are downloaded by millions of users annually. It's also true that most teenagers in the US at this point have access to either a smartphone, a computer, or both. 95% plus have a smartphone at this point with internet access, which creates opportunities to create digital supports for youth who may not have alternatives to digital treatment. available to them. However, there are a bunch of problems. Even though research has suggested that digital solutions can be really helpful, there are a bunch of problems or limitations in the apps and the options that are currently available. First of all, even those studies, really controlled scientific studies, suggest that some people may be helped by these digital mental health tools. The results from those really tightly controlled studies don't always speak to how well these interventions or treatments work in the real world. First of all, most digital interventions that are tested in clinical trials or in research studies don't end up being available to anybody except for those people in the research study. So they never become publicly available after the study ends, which of course, in my view, defeats the purpose of doing the study. If the treatment is helpful, but you aren't able to make it available to folks, then you're kind of back at square one. I won't go into this graph in too much detail, but I just want to let you all know that the most downloaded mental health apps out there, including things like Space, et cetera, have few to no elements of evidence-based treatments that have been developed and studied for years and years. So most apps out there have not been tested. They have not been subject to scientific scrutiny. So it's hard to say whether they're really useful for clinical problems. Once you start using an app, as I'm sure you all are aware, you don't always keep using it. I, for one, have dozens of apps on my phone that I've opened once and never again. Mental health apps are no exception. In research studies, people who participate in trials often get paid to complete a program, or they get incentives, or they get feedback from the research team that kind of keeps them going. But in the real world, none of that exists. So dropout rates from these programs that are app-based differ a ton in research versus in the real world. In research, half to 100% of users complete a digital treatment that they begin, mostly because of the incentives that are involved. But outside of research, completion rates drop from 1% to less than 30%. And the reasons for that, people don't have time, and people can't afford the in-app purchases that so often occur. And another really important piece is that teenagers, adolescents, often can't access certain online digital mental health supports without explicit parent permission. And sometimes teens want support without going to their parents. And I think that's a really complicated issue and a really important need to address. But part of our work, a big part of our work, is designed to empower teens to support their peers and to help themselves without requiring explicit parent permission and explicit parent gatekeeping. So clearly we need youth-focused digital mental health supports that include evidence-supported content based on research, are low cost and easy to use, and are free of access barriers like money and need for parent approval and involvement. So we are testing a bunch of different online interventions. So far, we've developed 3 that we are making publicly accessible to anyone who would like to try them. And I want to preview some of the work we're doing around these interventions, describe what they look like, and share some results of some recent clinical trials that have studied their effects over time. What are these interventions? Well, one is called Project Personality. It's a 30-minute online program that basically teaches people how and why all of us, no matter where we come from or what we're experiencing today, are capable of change simply because of how our brains are built. Another, Project Care, describes how and why self-compassion, being kind to yourself, is more likely to get you towards your goals and to help you out than self-criticism, which is a really easy cycle to fall into. And the ABC Project, or Action Brings Change, is designed to help people who are really feeling stuck in a low mood, figure out how and make a specific action plan for why and in what ways they can get going to engage in things that are personally meaningful and that fit with their values. So since founding our lab in September 2018, we've done a lot of work on these interventions. We have 13 different clinical trials that are either ongoing or that we recently completed. These are online. Some of them are in outpatient mental health clinics, and some of them are in doctor's offices and pediatric clinics and primary care. Over 5,000 teens and parents have tried out our interventions so far, and through feedback from those 5,000 teens plus, we've actually made a lot of changes to our interventions to make them better, because we know that the recipients of them are the best people to tell us whether or not they are useful and whether or not we can improve them. The National Institute of Health just funded a new trial where we're testing 2 of those interventions I just mentioned in 2,400 teens across the US. We've already had 1,900 take part in our study. All of our interventions are free. And importantly, this is a sort of scientific principle. All of our data, of course, after being anonymous, are public, so that anybody can access our data and our science, just like they can access our interventions. And this is part of a broader movement that's often called the open science movement in a lot of different scientific disciplines that really focuses on what you can give back, what you can return through your research, not just what you can learn. So how do we design a 1-session online intervention? What does that look like exactly? How do we go about developing those? Well, I want to share some principles that underlie or that explain how we build these interventions. And these are called the best elements of single-session interventions for youth mental health. B is for brain science. So a big part of each of our interventions is using actual neuroscientific facts to not just normalize the concepts that we're sharing, but to explain why they're true. It improves buy-in when we have actual science to back up the ideas that we're sharing. E is for empowerment. Our treatments are not designed to feel like treatments. Actually, all of our treatments are really invitations to teens who are completing them to help other teens and to help us as the researchers to make better treatments. And I'll show you exactly what that looks like in a moment. S is for saying is believing exercises. And that's an idea from a lot of marketing research and social psychology research that helps people solidify what they've just learned. And we have a lot of stories in our interventions, a lot of testimonials, firsthand accounts from actual adolescents and scientists who've seen these principles and experienced these principles working in real life. So this is how one of our interventions, Project Personality, opens. We, the researchers, let teens know that we need your help. We introduce ourselves as scientists from Stony Brook University who work with kids who are going through challenges and changes. We study personality and the brain and how these things relate to dealing with those challenges. We ask questions like, can people change? And if they can change, then how do they do it? And essentially, we ask the user to help us, the researchers, and future people, like other peers that they have, by completing this activity and sharing their thoughts and how they would explain these ideas to others and make their own personal stories as well. Users in the intervention hear stories from teenagers who've experienced depression or anxiety and learned through the principles that we focus on in the intervention and their own life experience that things, even when they feel completely stuck, do not last forever, that change is inherently possible, including in depression and anxiety symptoms. We introduced the idea of neuroplasticity, the idea that brains are constantly changing and capable of change, and that we ourselves can control some degree of that change, particularly by changing what we do, changing the kind of thoughts that come into our minds, the change, all of these things. So much of our daily activities can alter the connections in our brain and therefore parts of ourselves. So everyone's brain is a work in progress. So scientists say it's like connections in our brains are made with a pencil, not a permanent marker. That means it's possible for us to erase old connections and write new ones. It's not easy, but the idea of this program is to illustrate to folks why it's always a possibility. We describe research studies showing how and why parts of ourselves can change, including depression, but also including personality. We show data from actual adolescents showing that most people, when they start out in a new school, do feel quite lonely and worry about making friends. And most people at the end of that school year, if you follow them up, have made at least one really good friend, and a lot of them feel less lonely than they did before. So in terms of what the saying is believing activity looks like, that exercise that helps people remember what they just learned. That's a two-step writing exercise. First, we ask users to imagine a scenario where they were rejected, socially rejected by somebody who really mattered to them, who they thought they were friends with, totally shunned them. We ask users to write how they would feel and what they would think if this happened to them. Then we ask to imagine that actually that situation you just wrote about actually happened to some other kid that you know. Based on what you just learned about the brain, how personality works, how depression works, how anxiety works, what would you say to this other kid to help them understand that what they're going through isn't going to last forever, that they can change, that this other kid can change, that things aren't stuck? Here are a couple of responses that we've gotten recently. I would tell them to remember that even though it feels like these things will never end, nothing is forever. Maybe by being nice to the kid, you can make him realize that he's being mean and his neurons will help him change for the better. That was from a 13-year-old. People got different brains. Everybody's brain is constantly growing and changing. That friend of yours probably got some struggle going on in theirs and they may just need time. But even if they don't come back to be your friend, they're not the only person who would care about you. So as you can see, kids did a nice job of applying this idea to coping with a really difficult setback. And by completing this exercise, the idea is that users will internalize the main message in the program in the process. Now, these best principles guide in one way or another all of our interventions, how they're built, how they're structured. The content, though, differs for each intervention, such that a different skill or way of thinking or way of reevaluating a situation is taught in each one. We found in a recent clinical trial of project personality that compared to a matched control, so a comparison program that was also an online intervention, that it actually reduced depression in teens ages 12 to 15 over a 9-month follow-up period in a sample of about 100 teenagers. And that was the case across gender, family income, parent education, youth, race, and ethnicity, and whether kids were receiving other treatment at the time. In another study, we found this effect again. So we tested out project personality in 222 high school girls in North Carolina and compared it to basically an online one-session program teaching about healthy relationships. In the Growing Minds group and the project personality group, rates of clinical depression decreased from 38 to 29% over 4 months. And for girls in the control group, rates of depression increased from 37 to 40% over 4 months. So again, we see that this intervention, while brief, is sufficiently targeted to potentially be useful. About a year ago, we began to get some press for the kind of work that we're doing. So The Atlantic wrote an article about our lab and our research, and so did Vox, and that was very exciting for us. And it created a new challenge. So we started to get calls from teens, from families, emails, from a lot of people in the US and outside of the US asking if they could try our interventions. And at the time, this was about, last September 2019, we weren't set up to do that. We weren't set up to share these things broadly, but we wanted to be. And we felt like that was within the mission of our group and our lab to do that. So we created Project Yes. Yes stands for Youth Empowerment or Support. And this is an ongoing program evaluation of our single session interventions for teen mental health. Our goal is to evaluate the acceptability, basically whether people like it, and the short-term effects. So whether it improves things that we care about, like hopefulness and sense of control over life, depression symptoms, of 3 free of charge, open access, online single session interventions for teen internalizing distress. Internalizing distress is a really fancy research word for depression and anxiety. In line with the best principles, our single session interventions aim to target and strengthen helpful beliefs about the self and the world that we know from decades of other research are linked to depression and anxiety in teens. Here's the paper that we wrote up about our results, which you're welcome to read. It's open access online. But I'm just going to share with you exactly what this is. And any of you right now can go to schleiderlab.org/yes and try out the programs that I'm talking about right now. So Project Yes has 3 steps. Step 1, try an activity. So adolescent users anonymously can go on to Yes and pick one of the 3 online activities that we've developed to try out. Step 2, tell us what you think. Before and after completing the activity, the online intervention, we ask for readings of mood, certain beliefs about the self, senses of hopelessness, senses of hope. And we also ask for feedback, critical feedback on the activity, both good and bad, to see if it actually felt useful to folks. And 3, we actually ask teens to share their best advice for others who may be struggling. And we have this advice corner on the Yes website where you can see advice that other Yes users have left. This is one piece of advice from a teen user. Of course, it's an anonymous program, so we don't know who wrote this or where it came from, but this is something that we think is quite helpful and that teenagers who've done our programs have said is a nice feature that they can leave advice for others to benefit from. Okay. So I already talked about these interventions, but these are the 3 programs that you can choose from within Project Yes. You can do Project Yes as many times as you want. And again, they're free and they're anonymous. And what we found in the first 200 teenagers who completed Project Yes was that from before to after taking part in the program, hopelessness showed a 62% chance of decreasing. Perceived control, so a sense that teens could control their behaviors and their feelings and their thoughts, showed a 64% chance of improving significantly. And teens self-reported self-hatred or self-dislike, which is a really core symptom of depression, showed a 55% chance of decreasing. For one 20 to 30 minute online free activity, we think that's pretty good. We also found when we asked, compared to before you did this activity, how hopeless do you feel right now? About 75% said they felt a little or a lot less hopeless, with almost everyone else saying they felt the same amount. Again, we're very happy with those results. And I think they speak to the possibilities of scaling up something like this that's very cost effective and brief and low intensity for potential public mental health. Now I want to shift gears because I've been talking only so far about online single session interventions. But now I want to shift to single session programs that can be delivered by a person. Like I said at the beginning, a diversity of options is critical to addressing national and global mental health needs. As such, we're going to need multiple types of single session interventions in order to help make that dent possible. So much of our work for the first year and a half of our time at Stony Brook has focused really on this online approach. But we were recognizing more and more that this wasn't addressing the need for everybody, and some people wanted to talk to a person. So we needed to develop a person-delivered intervention, ideally one that could be delivered by anybody, whether or not they had formal mental health training. And one of the reasons I'm sharing this with all of you today is because when I developed the intervention, I had high schoolers in mind. I really wanted to make something that could be accessible to a high schooler to give to support their peers. So everything I'm going to share with you today is freely available online, all the worksheets and everything for the single session consultation that I'm going to share with you. If you think it would be helpful for yourself, or if you think it would be helpful for a friend, please feel free to share it. The single session consultation is a 1-session program based on a larger school of psychotherapy called solution-focused brief therapy. And I've adapted it to fit into 1 session and to be useful for teenagers and for adults with a wide variety of problems. It's very present focused. It targets a very specific problem that's specific to the person and a desired outcome. And the goal is to empower the user to take the smallest possible steps towards a future that matters to them. It's very, very brief. Step one is optional. That's for like, if you're doing a formal clinic-based therapy, then you would do a consent and safety check in the context of a clinic. But I'm going to go over steps 2 through 7, which is the entire intervention. This is also the entire intervention. It's literally a worksheet that you can fill out for yourself or for somebody else, or with somebody else. It's very simple. It's designed to be completable by anybody, and it's designed to adapt to whatever problem is most important to you right now. I'll be happy to share these slides with you after the fact, but these links are clickable. If you click on them, you can actually link right to that worksheet I just showed you. Okay, so what do you do when you're delivering the single session consultation? Well, first you establish with whoever you're talking to why you're here. When we tested this in our clinic at Stony Brook, we actually gave it to people who were on waiting lists for psychotherapy, people who were waiting for months and months just to see their therapist for the first time. We wanted to give them something in the meantime. And how we describe the single session consultation to them is like this. Lots of people who work with us can talk through the problems they've been experiencing and find that just one consultation can actually help quite a bit. And I'm willing to work hard in our hour together today to help you get a better handle on things, or at least to jumpstart change in a positive direction. It's really helpful when you're meeting someone for a single session support session to give them a lot of credit for showing up. It's not easy to seek help. It's not easy to be present when that help is being sought after. And let them know, well, this is for our clinic that we'll be recording some of what you talk about in the action plan. So that worksheet I showed you before, when you hit on important points of the conversation, you can record answers and responses on that worksheet to keep track of the progress being made during the single session consultation. The next step in the single session consultation is to identify and honor the person's top problem. That is, what is the most important reason you reached out for support today? What's the most important concern, the thing that gets in the way more than anything else right now that you want to get a better handle on? Why now instead of next month or last month? Now, the key for helping people to identify a useful top problem for the single session consultation is that it has to be something that can change. You're not going to be able to do much about unchangeable systemic problems in a 1-hour session. But as the guide, as the clinician, or as the therapist, or as the peer supporter, you can guide the other person to reorient their problem into one that can change. So let's say somebody's top problem is there is a global pandemic, hypothetically speaking. That's not modifiable. That's not something that anybody can change, right? What is changeable are your feelings about it. So instead of saying there's a global pandemic, I worry constantly about COVID and feel unable to stop worrying. Evidence tells us, research tells us that worry is something that can change with therapy, with support, with different strategies. The pandemic is not. So by reorienting to the feelings about the situation rather than the situation itself, you can help people identify a problem that they may have control over. After identifying the top problem, you identify the person's top hope for the session. So what needs to happen in this meeting for you to feel like this session was worthwhile? What are your best hopes for our meeting today? What would you most likely like to get out of this hour together? So a top hope is designed to serve as the positive opposite to a top problem. So if your top problem is, I worry constantly about COVID and feel unable to stop, your top hope might be, I hope to learn how to get through my worries just a little bit better. That is a very reasonable hope for a brief intervention. And if you can help somebody figure out just a chunk of their top problem that they may be able to get a step closer to addressing in your session together, you have won. The goal of this session is just to demonstrate to people participating that they can use their inner strengths and inner capacities to cope with what life is throwing at them, at least a little bit. So these are some examples of what folks have shared. For this person, top reason for seeking consultation, negative emotions surrounding a recent hospitalization. And the top hope for today's consultation was to come up with a plan and coping strategies for those negative emotions. Very reasonable, very doable. For another person, their top reason for seeking consultation was getting past negative emotions during the pandemic. So their top hope was finding more effective coping strategies. Another person said they wanted help with being more assertive, and their top hope was to feel more confident in standing up for themselves. So as you can see, the single session consultation can adapt to whatever problem is most important to an individual. So the real flexibility of this activity is quite helpful when you're dealing with people who lead complex lives with any range of problems that may be coming up for them on a day-to-day basis. All right, after you've identified the top problem and the top hope, you pose what's called the miracle question. And this is something that's really common in solution-focused therapy. You ask the person to imagine that a miracle occurred. Last night, a miracle occurred while you were sleeping. Your reason for seeking support today totally disappeared. So let's say your reason for seeking support was you're overwhelmed with negative emotions around the pandemic. You woke up and you're feeling fine. You're feeling totally fine. How would you know that there has been a miracle? What would you do differently? What would you think or feel differently to let you know that your problem has totally gone away? And you can ask the person just to, for a second, imagine what their life would be like without this stressor. How would their day be different? And you want to try to get as detailed a description from them as possible. At what point after waking up would they figure it out that their problem was gone, that a miracle occurred? And this can put somebody in the mindset of at least considering that an alternate reality is possible. After they've done their miracle day description, you ask them to make a scale based on this. On a scale from 1 to 10, with 1 being the furthest from that day you just described. So your problem is the worst it could possibly be. And a 10 being problem is totally gone. Miracle day has achieved, it is here, the miracle has happened. Where are you right now in this moment? 1 is the problem is the worst it's ever been, 10 is totally gone. I've given a lot of these sessions at this point, and I've supervised and trained a lot of people in getting them. Usually clients or folks receiving it say they're like between a 2 and a 5. Sometimes people say they're at a 1, but usually what I say to that is, well, if your problem were so overwhelming and severe that it was the worst it could possibly be, do you think you would have been able to show up for today's single session consultation? And usually they say, yeah, that's a good point, no. So you want to figure out where they're at on this scale. And then you want to figure out why they're not lower. Wow, you're at a 3? That means you're not at a 2 or at a 1. So what has helped you get to a 3? That's actually great. Something has helped you get from a 1 to a 3, and I want to help you reflect on what that is. So trying to get them to reflect on what strengths they've used, what strategies they've used to get to where they are today. Then you ask them if wherever they're at today is good enough. Usually they say no. And then you want to focus on, well, okay, let's say you're at a 3 today. How would a 4 feel different? How would things be different at a 4? And you spend the rest of the single session consultation trying to come up with a specific action plan for getting them from a 3 to a 4. Not from a 3 to a 10, just 1 point better. That is tangible progress. It's not realistic to think one session is going to cure all your problems. It is realistic to think you can make a plan for improving your life just a little bit in a short period of time. These are just some examples of the miracle question answers that people have given. So one person said they'd be okay with being alone. They'd be more productive. They get to sleep earlier. They'd be working on writing projects more actively. They'd be finding new exciting things, socializing. Another person said their miracle day would look like not feeling as stressed and anxious about expressing themselves. People would know their boundaries and standards. They wouldn't be as mad at other people about it, and people would respect them more. And I would actually be more considerate. So this is that action plan. What are 3 steps that you can take to get 1 point closer to your 10? Not to get to a 10, just to get from a 3 to a 4 or a 6 to a 7. And you as the clinician, as the provider, help them think of 3 very specific things they can do and 2 people or resources that can help them get there. The more specific, the better. So instead of, I can watch Netflix, okay, well, what can you watch on Netflix that you know is going to boost your mood? What show, what episode of The Office, for example, is going to make you happy just to see it? What if instead of call a friend, or text a friend, which friend, what time of day, and what are you going to say to them? So some examples. One person's plan was plan 1 enjoyable activity per day. They could have gotten more specific there. They could have said what that enjoyable activity was. And they also said when and where they can do this. And the reason we want people to identify when and where they can do this kind of thing is so that they don't have to think of it in the moment. When you're struggling, when you're in a place where you need this action plan, you want to make it as easy as possible for yourself to use it. So planning as much as you can in advance can go a really long way towards helping you actually carry out what you wanted to do. And you can see that this person identified their sister and a support hotline as things that could help them if they were really struggling to carry it out. Okay, after you make this, what are 3 things you can do to get 1 step closer to your 10? There's a part of the worksheet for the action plan that addresses the fact that it's actually very difficult to do the things on your action plan. Even if you know that they're the right things to do, it's a lot easier to say, here are the things that would make me feel better, versus actually doing the things that would make you feel better. There's often a really big disconnect between getting there from thinking to doing. So the action plan includes a place for making a plan for yourself to address an inner obstacle that may come up for you that keeps you from carrying out the plan that you just made. So this involves thinking about, as the person doing the program, what is it within you that might hold you back from taking these steps that you just outlined? It could be an emotion, a belief, a bad habit, or anything else within you. Then they write down their inner obstacle. And afterwards, we ask the person to think of 1 action or thought that they can tell themselves or do to overcome that obstacle. And all of a sudden, they have a coping plan. If their inner obstacle comes up, then they will do whatever action and thought they came up with. So for example, one person said their inner obstacle was falling into fatalism, thinking it doesn't matter. And their action or thought that they would use to overcome that obstacle, well, just think about how far you've come since getting out of the hospital, reflecting on all the progress you've made. And for that person, that would help them act opposite to that it doesn't matter impulse. Another person came up with a plan such that their inner obstacle was feeling like they don't deserve or they don't have enough confidence. And their action or thought to overcome that obstacle is it really going to be that bad? Is it really going to be so bad if I just try it? All right, and then at the end, if you're giving this to a friend or if you're a therapist giving it to a client, at the end of the action plan worksheet, there's a space for the therapist to write a personal note to the person who's receiving or participating in the single session consultation. Basically, you just want to write 2 reasons why you think that person in front of you is capable of making the changes they just described. So for example, the fact that you had a good day yesterday and were able to speak up for yourself tells me that you've already the potential to meet your goals. I know that you will implement this plan because from our session today, I can tell that you're determined and motivated. As you said, your attendance meant that you were being productive, which shows me that you're capable of making these changes. I wish you the very best, and I know that you can do this. And this is very different from how therapy tends to go. You really don't get a note of confidence from the person who's giving you support. But we found that we've gotten really good feedback on the fact that this note is provided because it lets people have a lasting reminder that what they wanted to do to help themselves is actually something that somebody believes they can do, even if at certain moments they don't believe it. So we ran a small study just to test out for the first time how the single session consultation worked, whether people liked it. This is called a pilot study. A pilot study is basically a very early stage assessment of whether an intervention is potentially useful. So we saw 30 people on our waiting list at our in-house clinic at Stony Brook University. And folks who just graduated from college were mostly the providers, along with some PhD students who were also some of the providers. When we asked people who received the single session consultation, all of them were waiting for longer term therapy. They were on wait lists. If they found it helpful, 48% said very much, 35% said mostly, nobody said a little or not at all. And 97% said they would very much or mostly recommend the consultation service to others. We also found that from before to after completing the single session consultation, people's levels of hopelessness showed an 86.59% chance of decreasing significantly. People's sense of control over their emotions and behaviors showed a 92% chance of improving from before to after the single session consultation. And we also followed up with all those 30 folks 2 weeks after they completed their consultation session. And we found that their levels of clinical distress actually showed a 76% chance of declining or improving from before the single session to 2 weeks later. That was while they were waiting for therapy. And I want to emphasize there that wait lists, when people are stuck on them, their problems tend to get worse. So the fact that we saw improvement, clinical improvement in folks who were waiting for therapy before they even got to their first session because of this consultation was really exciting. And we're looking forward to continuing to look at it in larger samples and different populations. Here's just some comments we got on it. I liked having a plan while waiting for a therapist. It helped me physically get my thoughts together. I feel very positive about my plan and I'm excited to begin trying it out. I liked my session very much and was surprised to find out there were solutions that I'd never tried. I appreciate being heard and helped. Thank you. So that's the end of my talk that I had for you today. I'd be more than happy to answer questions about any of this work or anything else you all have questions about.